Hello, Story Seekers. I'm Nico.
I'm Ben, and you're listening to our favourite part of the week.
Stories, discussions, and a high likelihood of gratuitous obscenities, all in the service of a bibliomancer. This is the Tiny Bookcase.
Regular listeners will know how it works, but for newcomers, Nico and I have both written a story to the same shared prompt.
We're about to share those stories with each other and you for the first time. Then we'll workshop them on mic. The prompt for this episode is Traitor, and you, Ben, are the first to be put on trial.
Traitor. The king died many years after I failed to end his reign. I had the reputation of a clever man at court, one which I arrogantly reinforced at every opportunity, citing ever that the greater good guided my motivations. But I confess, I had thought to place one of his 2 sons upon his throne, and to guide them with my sage advice. The elder son was married to my daughter, and in turn, they had been favoured with a son of their own. It was that boy's birth that was my call to action. I foresaw that the warmongering and vendettas of my liege's rule would ruin our people, leaving countless little boys like him fatherless and marked forever by the selfish calamity that was our king. I thought I could do better. I thought I could make a better king. I can find no fire in me to claim the same is true now, even in recollection, as my ideals have long since yielded to my fate. Every moment I spent in his dungeon, I knew that each wrong done in that man's name was something I had failed to prevent. It is strange to look back now and know that the section of my life that I spent in the dark for my crime was just that, a section. I never doubted that things had come before it. In fact, I clung to those memories. A smile, a meal, even a moment in the sun, all treasured like rubies as I sat chained to a wall I could barely see. My life, that of a courtier and landowner, was truly blessed before I cursed it. The hope that I might yet have a future is a pitfall into madness I seek to avoid. My sentence was death, of course, but no executioner's flat-tipped blade would take my head. Instead, I was to starve. The king's heir, the father of my grandson, had eaten the meal I had laced for his father, and as such the king decreed I was to die from deprivation. I still feel shamed that the insanity of hunger touched me within a few short days, and the mark it left is indelible. My wrists were shackled behind me, else I am sure I would have caught and eaten the rats that shared my cell. It was a week before my daughter came to me. She came nursing my grandson, and in turn offered her breast to me. In a hideous act of desperation, I clamped my mouth around her nipple, and drew what I needed with slurping sucks. I remember with great shame that I did not give the baby a second glance as I stole from him. Guilt still pulls my chin down when I think of it, despite what followed next. Her mercy was something I did not understand I should have refused until my hunger passed. So it was that I tore at her through the bars whenever she could slip down to see me, thirsty and ravenous. She persisted, deflecting my grasping hands and allowing me to siphon life from her babe. We went on like that for some time, until our deed finally came to light. The jailers reported that I had failed to perish within 2 months, and her part in it was quickly discovered. I did not see her again for many years. The king's wrath had distilled into something worse by then, and his chosen punishment for me twisted from the relative mercy of a slow death to a life wasted in the dark. They kept me fed after that, intending to prolong my torment. I tried to stop eating, but they would force me, and I was unable to stop them. I remember being strong and robust. Some at court might even have said that my waist was thicker than it ought to have been. That seems a distant memory, as my joints now grind like gristless millstones within my bony limbs. My skin, once hale and ruddy, looks like a monk's blotting paper. Careless ink-like bruises and blemishes are spattered over it from minor bumps. I had barely noticed that change in myself until the king died. Clemency. The jailer called it clemency when I was released. The word rang in my ears as I was removed from my cell. I held out a hand to clutch at the bars, not letting them take me. But they plucked me from that fate and escorted me up the stairs I had been dragged down years earlier. Liberty can be a terrifying thing to someone who has abandoned hope. It was summer when I emerged, and the gardens of the palace were filled with revellers, music, and verdant life. They sat me on a bench in those gardens for a time after I begged it of them. It took a long moment for my eyes to adjust to the dazzling light of day. As they did, I found myself entranced, watching a bee swim through the warm air to alight on a bright flower. The beast was unconcerned with the wreck I had made of my life, and I envied it, its ignorance of my wretchedness. The coronation festivities, my abashed jailers told me, were underway, and my freedom had been granted by the new king. He forgave me the attempt on his father that inadvertently took his brother from him, as it meant that he would now rule. I did not ask why my grandson was not first in line for the throne. They spoke to me in a way they had never done before. I began to realize they feared my reprisal for their role in my dark confinement. I did not know how to tell them I was incapable of such actions any longer. They escorted me to a steam-filled bathhouse in the palace, where servants cut the coils of filth-matted hair from my face and scalp. Then they scrubbed at me in shifts, cloths over their mouths to protect them from my stench. And I turned bucket after bucket of their warm, sudsy water into tar-black muck. I felt vulnerable when they were done, shorn of my overcoat of dirt, and the soft garments they pulled over my body felt strange and oversized. It was a moment before I realized they were my own feasting clothes from my life before the dark. The corridors I walked through to reach the feast felt familiar, each step taking me through a half-remembered nightmare. Within the long hall, I saw faces I had once treasured the memory of. They had aged, and they now wore masks of pity over their jubilation. I shuffled along to my audience with the new king. The middle-aged man, whom I had last seen as a youngster, leapt from his throne and came to meet me. Coughs punctuated his rehearsed words of remorse and forgiveness. I found I could not follow his words, and so when he fell on me, I returned his embrace. The king convulsed in my arms. His weight and the shaking of his body caused me to drop him. His crown slipped from his head and rolled away on the polished floor. Bloody bile spilt from his mouth. Someone was screaming, and I looked up to see my daughter pointing at me, her face twisted with rage. My gaze slipped past her to look at the boy who cowered in her shadow, the boy I had stolen from. I was seized. Someone must have struck me as I believe I lost time. The next I knew, the jailers were dragging me backwards down the steps and away from the light of day. They flung me into the dark cell, and I wondered for a moment whether I had dreamt the whole thing. Then my daughter came to me. Instead of the succour she had once brought me, the freshly appointed regent tossed the dagger through the bars of my cell. It fell, catching the light from the burning torch she held, and I found myself staring fixedly at it as she spoke to me of her deeds without remorse. She did not regret that her actions had left me imprisoned after she redirected my earlier attempt. After 2 kings, she said, my usefulness to her had come to an end. I had once thought of myself as a clever man, even perhaps a good man, but she assured me I was never anything more than a fool. She waited for a short time to see if I would reply, but I had no words. After that, she left me in the dark again. I can no longer see the dagger, yet I know where it is. It calls to me. I shall use it to open my throat when I find my courage.
So we've got a podcast first about to happen here. Because normally, now I would say something like, is there any historical basis to this? But I know this one.
Do you?
Yeah, I literally read about a painting very recently from, I believe, the reign of Louis XIV, where a prisoner was given breast milk by his own daughter. And as I sat, I thought, God, I wonder what else happened here. So thank you, because you've done my imagination's job for me.
So it's not actually from them. It's far earlier than that.
Okay.
It had a bit of a revival during the 1600s and 1700s,
Yeah.
that sort of Baroque period. But it's a sort of story known as Roman Charity, and it is a Greek or a Roman exemplary story.
Okay.
And it's essentially, as the story goes, it's the daughter breastfeeds her own father or her mother in some cases, in order to save them from their death by starvation that they've been imprisoned for. But I've obviously inverted that tale, because that tale is supposed to inspire this idea of sort of filial piety.
Yeah.
And my tale does not do that. It depicts an overreaching, simple schemer who is far surpassed by his daughter, who uses one of the things at her disposal in order to keep him alive for a future use.
Yeah. I mean, that was a fantastic twist. Even up to the daughter, screaming in the throne room and playing that part, and then just coming to say, well, I don't need you anymore. I don't need this cog for the machine anymore. So, kill yourself. It's a very, like, with the now, after the twist, with the ability to reflect on the story, it's a really nice engine to run the thing on. This purported act of kindness actually just being weaponized sexuality, not in a way of like sexiness, but of this is a thing I can do because I am a woman.
Yes.
So I will use that tool. It's very cool to see it, like you say, inverted in that way and made to be.
I think there's also a bit of a breakdown of the what happens when a patriarch is disassembled.
Yeah.
This is someone who was at the head of their family, was important at court, and all the rest of it. In whatever setting this is, it's probably some manner of very low fantasy medieval Europe. That kind of classic, almost like two done mode.
Yeah.
But it did interest me, this idea of him stealing. He's stealing milk, and I know there are some like practicalities. Like my understanding is that like sometimes the more that you feed, the more that you can feed. Things like that. Like
yeah.
But from his eyes, because he doesn't know those things, or he doesn't have the sort of ken of it, he thinks he's just stealing from his grandson, and he's willing to do it because he's starving.
Yeah.
Um.
So there is also I don't know if it's a genetic component, but some women just express a lot. And I know this because when I was born, I went straight into incubation and I was sort of monitored and popped away. And my mum was expressing so much milk that they were giving it to other women in the hospital who were struggling to express to give their babies. So my mum my mum was like basically a modern day wet nurse.
Well, I was going to say, like, my only exposure to this, because we don't have kids, has been through talking to a friend of mine who has recently had a child.
Yeah.
And I felt like there was some way to use that to deploy that in a story to dive deeper on some kind of archetype around this idea of like family structures.
Yeah.
So I'd sort of been waiting to deploy it at some point, and I think this is the first time I have.
I said all the stuff about turning the clean sudsy water into tar black. Yeah, it's that whole section of coming up, being clean, being put into his old life, and having been down in the dark so long that he'd actually was no longer acclimatized to sort of normal human living, even to the point of not really being able to find his words in front of the king. It's actually, it really drove home how much humanity he'd lost in that act of, or seemingly in the act of taking from his grandchild and, what have I become? But actually just because he had been broken successfully, death would have been a mercy some time ago, actually, for this man, really.
Yeah. It is an act of cruelty in this story. It's an act of cruelty that she feeds him, I think. Especially because we know that she has ulterior motives. She's not just trying to keep him alive.
Yeah, it's selfish.
Yeah.
Oh.
It's unpleasant. it's unpleasant. But yeah, any notes? Anything you think I should take a swing at, take a kick at?
I don't know. Not with that one. I think you did a really good job of. We were talking last episode about finding the ideas and knowing if it's the right length for what we do, and you are spot on with that one. You had exactly enough story there. So what it needs to feel like is a chunky anecdote. I think that's what I'm starting to realise. The kind of stories, much like this started, that you tell in the pub before people would be like, I really need to go and grab another pint now. And you found that really well in this one because it was very compelling without ever needing to. And if I wanted to now, I could have asked, what world is this? Is this? Because in my head, it was that kind of 16th, 17th century Central European kind of place. But, it could just as easily have been, when he came out, these people have experienced magic and they think he is magic because he suddenly makes the next king die, or there are lots of little strands in there, but placed so neatly that it doesn't leave any kind of looming thing over you. So there, I think you've done really, really well. Language-wise, really nice. You found the voice of the character, I think. Although it would be interesting to see if you could make the quality of the language dissolve a little as the story goes on.
Okay.
To show that he is, because at the end, when he's very eloquently says, I couldn't find my words. And it does jar a little with that character now. I mean, it's a difficult one because your internal monologue, is there any reason for it really to be? It's been his only company, so it probably would be still pretty much up to snuff.
Reasonably well developed, I think, internal monologue. And that is what we're seeing. Like, we don't know it at the start, but what we're actually seeing is him going over everything that's happened to him so that he can summon his courage to kill himself. Now that he has the opportunity, and he's been completely ruined and lied to on multiple occasions. So I think it is reasonably eloquent because he's not making just an emotional decision to kill himself. It's not like a sudden desperate act. He's retreading, and
it's the other way.
Yeah. So it's an interesting point. I think potentially if I had him speak aloud, I would have him. I think that's an interesting point to sort of say, why don't we see how his spoken language has devolved.
But I mean, you did a great job because you had said, he spoke well at court and was well thought of at court. So at the end, it's a great juxtaposition to hear that he doesn't anymore. And I think you're always going to write well when it's this kind of story, because these are the kind of stories that you have the most experience telling. You are very good at writing and improvising in this setting. And that is not a negative thing in any way. It's always great to hear you get that knife out and just put a little bit more edge on it.
That's nice. I like that. Yeah, this idea of improvising, I think, is quite an interesting one, especially when we're talking about something that's been written in the first person. I think that's there's something that, because it doesn't work for some stories, but for others, just going for it in the first person, you will find something, because if your character is in an interesting enough place, or they're an interesting enough person to begin with, then any growth and or regression that they have is going to be relatively easy to put over some sort of act structure.
Yeah. I mean, it's a thing that authors have spoken to us about before. People say, "Oh, I wanted the character to do this, but they didn't let me." It does happen when you're writing in first person. The story starts to move, and you're reacting how the character would react as they've grown in your writing. So it's always interesting when you write someone over a long form piece, isn't it? Because by the end you know them better. and you have to go back to
Yeah.
the beginning and go, oh God, why did I say they did that? They wouldn't do that. And yeah, I
Yeah.
think getting that out in a short space of time is something you are good at. You're very good at it, in fact.
It's all very nice. Thank you. I'll.
Most welcome.
I think. I think this is a piece that I'm going to revisit and see if I can punch it up a bit more. But I'm pretty pleased with it where it is. So we'll leave it there for now.
Like I said, there are things you could probably do to it, but I think it would depend where you wanted to go. Like if you wanted to turn it into flash fiction, how could you sharpen it up is one thing, but if you wanted to expand it, I don't think you could get a full book out of that bit, but out of
No. Oh
the
God, no.
female character, you probably could.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think if I wanted to add a few hundred words to it, I think it probably would be in world building.
Yes.
Because there's almost no time devoted to that. We know that it's some sort of palace with dungeons and gardens, and that they have sort of a monarchical structure,
Yes.
and that's it.
But
Yeah.
it's left blank enough that we can make our own decisions about it without impacting the story you've written too much.
Mm.
Because it doesn't matter if I think there are dragons there, because they don't show up.
Mm.
So it's not important.
Not relevant to the story.
Yeah.
Oh, fascinating. Thank you. Well, I think you're up, man. Who's your traitor?
You son of a traitor. The roar of the engine was like white noise now. It barely filtered through the earpieces, even when the increased torque caused it to bellow like a wounded bull elephant. Normally, the strange audio fog of the earpiece would be filled with the crackling comms of the co-pilot. What any other driver wouldn't have given for the information that normally rumbled from the passenger seat. Bo wasn't every other driver. Right now, he would settle for directions. The course layout changed every race. That was part of the fun. But every other car out there would have someone blessed with a rip-off map. Bo had been forced to come up with a new plan. Nothing higher than second place, follow the cars in front, make a burst when you see the finish line. Easy. His driving was far faster than he was. His brain now was catching up with the situation, and there wasn't much hope if things went on like this. The deep silver wound that started where the wing mirror had once been, and flash still open in the green paint of his baby, told him he needed more information on when the turns were coming up. No co also meant that the weapons weren't being used. No weapon use meant no weight drop during the mid-pack, which meant that fuel might be a fucked issue. Everything was planned so carefully normally. That was your co's job. He hadn't meant to fight with Miguel. They'd lost a couple of races recently, but Miguel didn't seem to understand why it was his fault. The burnout in Dallas had all been because of fuel distribution. The late firing of the nitrous had cost them precious seconds in Vermont, and Rio. Bo got angry all over again thinking about Rio. He felt his foot press a few degrees closer to the ground and heard the thirsty engine slurp and growl appreciatively. Rio was a shit show. Miguel evidently didn't know right from left. One bad call out and they ended up shearing a quarter of the bonnet and an entire wheel off their own car with machine gun fire. Thank fuck for roll cages. All that because Miguel called for a goddamn left. That wasn't why Bo had fucked his wife at the post-race party. It wasn't even why he'd asked the Dutch driver with that weird name, Verkloppen or whatever, to join in too. But it had helped. Miguel had quit on the spot, taking the keys to the car with him. "Pick it up in Berlin, shithead," had been Miguel's last words before he disappeared into the crowd of shit-faced drivers, co's, and their adoring, eager-to-strip fans. His wife had chased after him, a drizzle of Dutch jizz still clinging to her thigh. Not even that good of a lay. About the same level as her husband was a co-pilot. The officials hadn't actually wanted Bo to race in Berlin. They'd made him sign some stupid form, not their fault if he dies, not supposed to drive without co, blah, blah, blah. The pit crew had all been told they weren't needed and gone before Bo even arrived. The hastily patched up Green Thunder was simply sat in his pit zone, full of ammo and fuel, with the keys on the driver's seat. A squad of one. Fucked if he did, fucked if he didn't. Bo had to race, for his pride. Couldn't let Miguel win. He snapped back to the race as a shunt on his right side showed that the huge muscle car belonging to the British driver was trying to bear him off the road. Bo wasn't taking that. He was going to be a target with no co, so he'd come prepared. He yanked at the belt hanging from the ceiling. He'd whipped it from the rings on his jeans last moment to jerry-rig the swivel mount of the weapon. It turned violently with his tug, and the momentum yanked at his arm, sending a shock of pain darting down his side. With effort, he placed the belt between his teeth, reached across his shifting hand, and clicked the gun to lock. The pressure on his mouth subsided as the mounting squeezed closed. Then he had to make the risky play, lifting his body almost fully across, his toes pressed hard against the accelerator. His stretched form twisted to grip the handles and squeeze. The firing mechanism compressed. In heartbeats, hundreds of small caliber rounds pounded into the side of the hulking British vehicle. The dull thud of something important breaking was audible even through the earpiece. The huge car slid backwards out of his view, and Bo threw himself back into the seat. Where had the car in front gone? Tyre marks indicated left. Turn left. He began the process of pivoting the vehicle, looking for that sweet left. All too late, he noticed it was a setup. A short alleyway, little more than a glorified parking spot. He needed to turn the other way and extremely fast. Pushed a foot through the brake pedal, a cardinal sin for a driver of his ranking. Fast or fucked, as the pit crew saying went. Nothing happened. Fuck, son of a bitch! Bo's foot was off the accelerator now, but momentum from 212 miles an hour doesn't fall off too fast. Panic set in. What could he do? So much of his brain was dedicated to going as fast as possible, he'd never really focused on what happened when he needed to go slow. The thoughts felt sluggish, but he knew there were seconds until impact. The adrenaline naturally coursing through him, and the nuclear-grade energy slush he chugged before the race were working in concert. It bought time. What options did he have? Brakes were fucked. He was already turning, and that was about to become a spin. How do you stop when the driver can't control the car? Co-brake. In the glove box was the co-brake, a big red pull handle only for dire emergencies. Bo threw himself sideways. The momentum of the car's now full spin, making him feel as though he'd fill the whole space with vomit. The glove box clicked open, and he reached blindly and yanked at the broad red handle. It came free with a clunk. The handle and rod was sheared clean through. Bo lifted it dumbly to his face. Scratched into the red plastic through the lumpy warning label was some message. "Fuck you, Bo," was all it said. The impact broke Bo Bayron's ribs and spine. His body, bent as it was across the front length of the car, twisted uncomfortably. Green Thunder burst into brilliant incandescent flame, and the remaining ammunition added to the explosion that tore the vehicle apart. and began to level the building it had impacted against. In a dingy hotel room somewhere in Berlin, Miguel raised a glass of cheap bourbon to the hollow screen as the car disintegrated.
Wildcard, baby.
Nobody wants a wild card on their team. Why would anybody want that?
No, I had a lot of fun with that. That was really fun. Initially, I thought you were going for like Have you seen the movie Rush with
Yes.
Daniel Bruhl and Chris Hemsworth? Yeah, that kind of like Niki Lauda, James Hunt rivalry was where I thought you were going with it.
Yeah.
But I really enjoyed this idea of the co-pilots being the traitor. I feel like you nailed this this idea of it being almost like a rally that they need someone to navigate and stuff. It's not just
Yeah.
like a random thing. Yeah, but obviously it then becomes more sort of Death Racy and Mad Maxy
Yeah.
with the weapons and such. I also enjoyed the world building around like the sort of rock star bit of their job. This is
Yeah.
that kind of orgiastic groupie mentality around it indicates that the whole thing is just mental, and these are people that are blowing off steam in a way that wrecks lives, and you get that from really early on. So that's really well done.
Oh,
I
I'm glad.
I wrote down drizzle of Dutch jeers because that might actually be one of the more heinous things you've ever written.
Is it the
Because
drizzle?
I think it's because you just throw it away. Do you know
Oh
what I
no.
mean? You just
Yeah.
sort of throw it away, and I mean it's incredibly demeaning to that character, isn't it? But then I guess she has demeaned herself, so it does make
Yeah.
sense. And it does set up the central tenant. I think for myself, it might just be because we know that the prompt is traitor.
Yeah.
I could have maybe done with a little bit more disguising what was about to happen. Because I love this image of him getting there to the car. It's like barely fixed, and the keys are on the driver's seat. That's really good. But like nobody's getting in that car. If they've just the guy that drove it there, he's just cuckolded him. I think, like either we need to see more of the mental gymnastics around why he's getting in that car,
Yeah.
or have something that maybe takes his mind off it, or like distracts him.
Well, I think more of how blinded by his ego he is might be
Yeah, yeah.
important. Yeah.
Um, that's a minor thing. Like I think I think it works really well as a story. This idea of this like callous, heartless bastard, and he's exactly who he needs to be the driver. And it sounds like he's like one of the top drivers.
Yeah.
So I think you've really captured that kind of psychotic, competitive mentality that you find in any high level professional sport. Like I know I've been going on to you about watching the Netflix show Quarterback because it's just
Yes.
filled with fucking nutters. Like not just the men who are the quarterbacks, but their wives are also nutters. Their coaches are also nutters. Like everybody there is a nutter because
I'm just going to say on Mike, I don't have any problem with any quarterbacks. You're all very big. Please don't hurt me. Your wives are lovely, I'm sure.
but it's all around that like they're just geared towards this one thing. Everything
Yes.
in their life is geared towards this one thing. It's making the best play possible. And you got that in this story because everything around this guy's life is about winning. It's beating everybody, even beating his own co-pilot.
Yeah.
And he'll do anything to do that. And I think there's more there for you. I reckon just a little bit more.
Yeah, it's definitely one that as I was writing it, I had this sensation of I kind of really want to explore this world more.
Mm-hmm.
I think this would benefit from having. Do you know what it feels like? It feels like maybe an anime or a short TV series with an insanely high budget because you would need it to do all of the
Do all the action
stunt
stuff. Yeah.
driving and special effects. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's a very cinematic concept, I think, and it would be nice to see, these guys at the top of the game and watch that relationship slowly start to break down. Because I mean, it's quite clear that he's making mistakes and blaming his co-pilot, or 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, but he can't see himself at fault. So, you know, even as I was finishing it, I was thinking, oh, I wish I had another 5 to 10,000 words to put into this one, because I think
Yeah,
it could actually really benefit from it.
potentially. I mean, I think it will work as a short story, and it does work as a short story, um, because it's around this like central betrayal, which is, you know, it's there. You've got it. Like I think building up to that betrayal would be like if you were to talk about like a TV series or something, could be quite interesting for like a mini series. But I think you've got it here. Um, just whilst we've been talking about it, I've just had this other thought that what about setting up this race as the biggest race?
I like the winner takes all grand finally type thing.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Because there's a bit where you sort of run through all the different races and how they went,
Yes.
and it would be very easy to put like a line in that's something like, and everything was building to this.
Well, yeah, he'd barely qualified for this because of all that, and it's the big one. And
Exactly, yeah.
yeah,
Like he's got everything to prove, and this is the place to prove it. I think that would potentially tighten it up a bit because then it means that the tension in the story builds naturally with the tension in the character.
yeah,
Um, and it sort of puts us in his mind a little bit because at the moment he's so callous and so driven, no pun intended there, but the that he is unrelatable.
yes,
Whereas if you put him in a pressure cooker situation, not just because we know his job's violent, but he doesn't give a fuck. It's a day in the office to him.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, maybe raise the stakes on that a particular race because then all of a sudden you've got a reason why he gets in the car.
yeah. I
Um,
think it's really good feedback.
yeah. The other one, this is a really small bit, right? But
Go on.
when he crashes,
Hmm.
you say broke his ribs and his spine.
Yeah.
I would say just go spine, go straight for spine.
Okay. It's.
'Cause-
I think it's because of how because he was sort of he was facing the front. I imagined that crunch, crunch.
yeah,
But yeah, you're right. Just broke him in two.
I like the
But then
use
it
of
sounds like
spine
it
because
came
it
in half.
sounds
Yeah.
like a doctor afterwards telling him what's happened, or
Yeah.
someone on the news saying this is what happened to him in his final moments.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, there's. I tell you what, a good place to look for that kind of thing would be. Do you remember the? Obviously, it happened way before we were around, but the Bluebird land speed record and then water speed record,
Oh yes, yes.
and the reason I know that is because I for a while I grew up in Coniston. I went to which is in Cumbria in England,
Yeah.
and the Coniston Water is where he died, setting the world speed record.
Oh
Um,
crikey.
and my understanding, and one of the first bits of information that really stuck in my head about that crash, is that they are fairly sure that he decapitated himself during
Yeah.
during that run, and it's those like little just horrid injuries that happen in someone's final moments that give that like horrid little nasty but delighted feeling when you're watching extreme sports. I think.
Yes. Yeah. No, you're right.
Um, yeah, but I loved it. I thought it was really cool. I thought it was really cool. Um, thoroughly enjoyed it. Where did this just pop into your head, or was it something you've
So
been working on for a while? Or
so someone who shall remain nameless was telling me about a thing they called the drill book.
oh yeah, no,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think I've heard that guy speak. I think he's got a podcast.
Nice guy, handsome dude.
Yeah, no, he's pretty handsome. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Really cool dude. But but yeah, I was trying to work out what I wanted to do with the prompt, and I wrote down some idea, sort of situations where you might find a traitor, and while I was doing it, I was sort of adding to it the things that are on my mind, things I fancied writing about, and there's a tabletop game I really like called Gaslands, which is a kind of Mad Maxy, death racy, people driving fast cars and shooting each other. And because I was thinking about that game, I thought I've got to get it out of my head, and it sort of warped into this idea. And this does not have a lot in common with Gaslands now that it's over, because it's not on Mars or any of the other mad sci-fi stuff that's happening in that game. But it was a little seed planted because I wrote it down on the the scrap of notepaper that I was using to drill into ideas.
It's very
And that
cool.
was one of the things that got moved from the right hand to the left hand, as per your instructions.
Well, I think it works well as a as a concept. The betrayal of the co-pilot and like what we're talking about is sabotage.
Yes.
Um, and there's built into that, like hard coded into that approach is that the bottom of the stomach dropping out moment when you realize
Yeah.
that you're fucked. And I felt like you nailed that. That you completely nailed. Like that feeling of fuck was top notch. Absolutely.
Yeah, I
Um,
think there's always almost a desire to make that moment longer than it needs to be, but there is something nice about the clunk, fuck you, done, because it you get that slowdown, and I give myself that opportunity by saying it's adrenaline, and they've got these like crazy energy drinks that they're having.
hmm.
In any moment like that, anytime you have slow mo, it's the bit where it snaps back to full speed that's always the bit that makes you go, oh. And I think, yeah, it was cool to get that into a story. It's very fun.
Totally agree. Totally agree. Oh, what fun! I felt like we both, because obviously you were inspired by a tabletop game that you really like, and you wanted to um, go somewhere original with it and for yourself.
Yeah,
And I was sort of pretty comfortably kicking around some concepts that I use in a tabletop game as well, which is I know people probably know already, but we do quite a lot of role playing, which is where we get. I think probably where the two of us bonded initially on
yeah,
storytelling before it
I'd agree.
became a podcast. Um, and it's nice. It's nice that these things can inform what we do. I mean, here would be the perfect moment to bring up, like for example, Henry Cable and his love of tabletop games and how they actually inform his work.
Yeah,
And whilst there's two reasons why I'm not making that comparison too directly. The first is that obviously Henry Cable is a fucking god and really successful. The second is that I have absolutely no idea what's happening to that guy's career now. Like he appears to be getting. I might be completely misinformed here, but he appears to be getting sort of cancelled for being too into the subject matter of the thing that he was doing.
yeah. It's a weird one. I think a lot of stuff's happening all at once as well. Like the James Gunn changes to the DC world. I think they've just recast Batman as well, haven't they?
I think there
So
has
they
been a whole bunch of changes, haven't they?
so I think that's come at one point, and no one. I certainly don't know if there was any kind of Superman based bad blood. Like if anyone came in wearing green jewelry, you'd run out screaming or whatever. But apparently he was pretty intense on the set of The Witcher. But we weren't
I,
there, so we
I,
can't
I,
really
I
pass
also
comment.
never understand this complaint about actors. They are paid to be intense as a fucking profession. That's the whole
Yeah,
job is to do that. And I know like people that are being, they're like I'm a method actor, and a lot of people do seem to use that as an excuse to just be like dicks to people. But at the same time, a lot of my favorite performances from people are the people that are method acting. So I kind of don't care. It's their job. They're doing their job, and part of their job is to be really intense all the time. So I don't know. That's my take on that. I think it may well come out that people have done some horrendous shit, but
I think we should do bad things generally, and then just say I'm a method actor, and
I'm a
offer no
method writer.
further explanation. So, like, I don't know, I'm a method writer is what you use when you're drinking scotch in the afternoon, Ben.
When I was in Boston, I went into a bar that apparently Bukowski had drunk at,
Yeah.
and like had some sort of bourbon, I think, and I just felt like such a fucking wanker. Like it's such a silly thing. Like people, there's this idea that people have that you need to be a well, not all of them, but there are some great writers throughout history that are just drunks.
Yeah.
You can't write well if you're in the middle of a 2 month bender. You just fucking can't. Like your brain doesn't work properly.
after about 6 hours drinking, I can't speak well, let alone write well. It's
But I think those people were, again, very intense people in their lives, in their
yeah,
interpersonal relationships and everything like that. And that kind of behavior sort of follows, sort of hand in glove, really, doesn't it? Um, yeah, I don't know.
I think
I'd like to think that it's possible to be really, really good at something without turning into a complete twat with massive dependencies on either like alcohol or drugs.
yeah, it's everything though, isn't it? It's acting, writing, music. We do see it a lot. We see a lot of
Big
people
time.
overdosing, and yeah, I'm very proud of being a musician. I hope I don't have to start taking heroin to really make it. I'm not ruling it out if someone else pays.
No, I remember during your last tour, I was really impressed with the way because you had a crazy schedule for like 2 weeks of a tour,
Yeah.
and you just weren't drinking because even though you
No.
were performing in bars and pubs and all the rest of it, like you knew that you were going to have to sing so much that the idea of having a few pints was just going to screw you up. It was going to set you back. It was going to ruin
Yeah.
your performance. I don't know. There's a time and a place, I think, for all that jazz.
Yeah, mate, as soon as the tour was over,
Well, yeah,
was
well, we went out, didn't we?
we did.
It's a good old time. Right, I think we're prattling now. I think we've gotten pretty far from writing and storytelling. But I've enjoyed telling these stories together. I feel like we're sort of leaning into the space that we've got to be able to give each other some fairly good and strong feedback.
Agree. There's been some solid workshopping in these last few, and it's nice because I think we don't give as much time to it as we would. Not that we'd like to, but I think when we've got a guest here, obviously we value their time a huge amount,
Obviously, yeah.
and we don't want to be like, sorry, Ben and I are just going to talk for 15 minutes about this sentence.
Hey,
But it
sometimes I do
is
that anyway, but like I always feel bad about it afterwards, whereas I don't feel bad about it with you.
well, that's because we love each other.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of The Tiny Bookcase.
Remember to subscribe, otherwise you're going to miss out on the future fun.
Also, tell a friend. If you like this episode, link them to it.
We'd be tremendously grateful. You can follow us on Twitter at BookcaseTiny, Facebook at The Tiny Bookcase, and Instagram at BookcaseTiny for updates. Speaking of supporting the podcast, well, magic can only take one so far. The Tiny Bookcase is supported by the generosity of its patrons. Those kind souls have really kept my belly full the last year. Let's cast a spell for them, shall we? For magnificent beardery, let's cast the Chinicus folliculale spell on Gary Laird. For rich ginger tones on the scalp, let us cast the Orangi Hedondo spell for Scott Byrne. And for general fabulousness, why not the Ooh La La How's Your Mother spell on Matthew McLaren?
How do you come up with that shit, man?